January 1813. A continent lies frozen, shrouded in the bitterest winter in living memory. For the soldiers of Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Army, this is not just a season, it is a relentless and forgiving enemy. The grand dream of a conquered Russia has shattered, replaced by a nightmare of ice and snow. This is the story of the retreat and descent into a frozen hell, and the unraveling of an empire. Just months before, they had marched east as the most magnificent army Europe had ever seen. Over 500,000 men from 20 nations, a wave of color, steel, and ambition, confident in their emperor and their destiny. They were the conquerors of Austerlitz, of Jena, of Wagram. Moscow was supposed to be the final jewel in Napoleon's imperial crown. But Moscow was a hollow prize, a city of ash and eerie silence. The victory they had anticipated never came. The Tsar refused to surrender, and as the first snowflakes began to fall, a dreadful realization dawned upon the French command. They were stranded, hundreds of leagues from home, with a Russian winter closing in like a trap. The order to retreat came too late. The journey back was not a military maneuver, it was a desperate flight for survival. The once proud soldiers, clad in their magnificent but wholly inadequate uniforms, were now reduced to ragged specters. Their path was a brutal, windswept corridor of white. Stretching endlessly before them, temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows, 30. Even 40 degrees below freezing. Frostbite was a constant, merciless predator. Fingers, toes, noses turned black and numb, a prelude to a slow, agonizing decay. Men would lie down to rest in the snow, a moment's respite from the grueling march, only to never rise again, their bodies frozen solid in the posture of sleep. Food, the fuel of any army, became an obsession. The scorched earth tactics of the retreating Russians had left the landscape barren, supplies were non-existent, the soldiers' rations dwindled to nothing. They gnawed on frozen leather from their own equipment, boiled scraps of horsehide, and fought over the carcasses of fallen horses. Starvation turned comrades into rivals. Stripping away the veneer of discipline and civilization, the desperate hunt for sustenance became the sole purpose of each waking, agonizing moment. The ghosts of the fallen littered the roadside, frozen monuments to the army's demise, their pockets turned inside out by those who followed, searching for a single forgotten biscuit. And they were not alone in this frozen wasteland. The Cossacks, Russia's phantom cavalry, were ever present. They materialized from the blizzards like wraiths, striking the exhausted, straggling columns with terrifying speed. They were masters of this environment. They harried the flanks, picked off stragglers, and vanished back into the swirling snow before any meaningful resistance could be mounted. For the French soldiers, the howl of the wind was often indistinguishable from the war cries of the Cossacks, a constant psychological torment that added to their physical misery. Every shadow in the woods, every gust of wind, could signal a sudden, violent end. Meanwhile, back in his carriage, or poring over maps in a captured hut, Napoleon watched his creation disintegrate. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe, the master of battle, was now a spectator to a catastrophe he could not control. He was surrounded by the finest generals of the age, devout, brought men whose names were synonymous with victory. But their genius was useless against the forces of nature. What good were brilliant cavalry charges or intricate infantry formations against a blizzard? The emperor's face, usually a mask of calm authority, now showed cracks of despair. He saw not just an army dying, but his entire empire beginning to crumble. Its foundations frozen and fractured. The crossing of the Berezina River stands as the epic, tragic climax of this ordeal. It was a race against time. The main Russian armies were closing in from the north and south, aiming to encircle and annihilate what was left of the Grande Army. The river, not yet fully frozen but choked with treacherous ice floes, was the only escape route. In an incredible feat of engineering and raw courage, Dutch pontoon bridge engineers, working in the freezing water, managed to construct makeshift bridges. The desperation of the crossing was absolute. The bridges groaned under the weight of a panicked mob, soldiers, cannons, wagons, and thousands of civilian camp followers all scrambling for the western bank. Russian artillery began to rain down on the chaotic scene. Shells tore through the crowds, splintering the wooden planks and sending bodies tumbling into the icy water below. The screams of the wounded and the dying were lost in the roar of the cannons and the grinding of the ice. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, commanded the rearguard, fighting with suicidal courage to hold back the Russian advance and buy precious time for the crossing. When the bridges were finally set ablaze to prevent the Russians from following, thousands were left stranded on the eastern bank, abandoned to their fate, either the sword of the Russians or a slower death in the cold. Berezina became a byword for disaster. By the time the last remnants of the army staggered across the border and out of Russia, the Grande Army was no more. Of the more than 500,000 who had marched in, fewer than 30,000 remained as a coherent fighting force. It was a loss on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. An entire generation of young men from France and its allied nations had been swallowed by the Russian winter. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered forever. News of the disaster spread like wildfire across Europe. The conquered nations, long resentful of French domination, saw their chance. Prussia, a reluctant ally, switched sides and joined Russia. Austria soon followed. The War of the Sixth Coalition had begun. The retreat from Moscow was not just the end of a campaign, it was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. The road from here would lead through the monumental Battle of Leipzig, the invasion of France itself, and ultimately, to the emperor's first abdication and exile. The winter of 1812 to 1813 serves as a stark and terrible reminder of the limits of human ambition in the face of nature's power. It is a story of hubris and its horrifying consequences, written in the snow with the blood of hundreds of thousands. The ghosts of the Grande Army still haunt that long, cold road from Moscow, a silent testament to one of history's greatest military calamities. The fall of an empire began not in a great battle, but in the silent, deadly embrace of a Russian winter. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. If you found this documentary insightful, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next one.